after the assassination of Amenemhet in the 12th dynasty, we start to see a large amount of detail and evidence that would show unsettledness or weariness in this region. One is documented in the tale of Senewi that we've read several times, but we shall see again what they say that has to do with this period. But before we go into the story of Sennacher, to get a full context, because a lot of people remember they were talking about how the context of the story of Sennacher was, I want us to read something by Senraset, the king at the time, at the death of Amenemhet, and this will put the whole story into context. So, not to reread the whole story of the Tale of Saneher, the Tale of Saneher speaks of Amenemhat who dies, and like we saw last time, he died, and then Senraset takes over. But Seneha heard that there was a plot by the people. He heard the plot, and feeling uneasy, he runs away, and he goes from Nubia to Libya and ends up in Syria, where he is gathered by some people who have knowledge of the Egyptians, and he has a place to stay. And then eventually he goes back to Egypt when he is pardoned and is reinstated in his position by Senraset. Now, what's interesting about this story is that it's not necessarily a real one, but it's not as it tells us a lot about what was happening at the time. And of course, it tells us when he mentions the part where he says, um, a man from the marshes lost in Abydos, or a man from the marshes lost in Nubia, we can tell that this is a time of war. This is a time of dissension, a time of confusion. And so these comments are not throwaway lines. They mean something very deep. But to add to this is that in the time of Senraset, there was some need for a fix. And one of those fixes, since Senraset was represented by Ra, given that his name was Kepakara, Ra in the living, or the son of Ra. And this name was very important and was then used for taking over a lot of the religious centers. This is where the first time, not the first time, but this is the time when you start to see a consolidation of the Ra's. So Amun Amun becomes Amun Ra, Horus becomes Horus Ra. All these Ra's become people who, because this guy is represented by Ra, all these other gods get represented by Ra as well, thus consolidating the religious power of Egypt and returning Egypt to a unified place. And so someone like Seneha, if rewritten the story after this, would have not looked at these two places in the Delta and Abydos as if they're somewhat different, but instead the same because of these reforms. Combining Egypt as one nation was fair enough, but he also wanted to take religious and actual power from Nubia, and in doing so, which by the way, Nubia was never, for the longest time, never fully accepting of this, but they did fall under it because, like I showed you last time, they were happy with the religion of the Egyptians, which is why some people posed as pharaohs and even posed as, sons of Ra, sons of Horus, and stuff like that. And so, Senraset the First erects a bunch of temples and a bunch of monuments in Nubia in order to appease the religion and the people. But the borders of Egypt from Nubia were just never safe ever, even though lots of these things were done. Senraset created this chapel, which is called the White Chapel or the Jubilee Chapel, and he further built other things. But this chapel will be destroyed by one of his successors. And you will see that if we look into his successors, the Nubians continue to be a problem, and that his efforts to try and stop the Nubians are a waste. This also tells us that Nubians entering Egypt was numerous. We're talking about a lot of people entering Egypt here in large numbers, both captives and people who were basically taking over parts of Egypt, and people who didn't want to stop or give away power from their own lands. And those own lands, when they were considered parts of Egypt, it just was not respected by a lot of Nubians. The problem is they also had wars with Asiatics. Nubia, which they didn't realize this, was a seemingly endless land, in that the more you go down, the more you find more Nubians. And the more you go down, the further there are more Nubians. Asia has the same problem. There's more Asians, there's no stop. They can keep fetching more people. But it didn't stop there. Before Amenemhet and Senreset, there were allies of the Nubians. These allies are the ones that were crushed by Amenemhet, right? Some of the people, there's inscriptions that detail the fact that there were allies in Nubia with the Egyptians who kind of helped the border of Nubia and Egypt, rather than, this was during the intermediate period, rather than being enemies. And this is who Amenemhet probably crushed because of their insistence of being Egyptian in rule, not just in the fact that they were Egyptian. But not only were allies shifting, but powers themselves were shifting heavily. And so, if we look at the world at this very time, we can see that there's great shifting both in Africa and in Asia, where you see this is about 2000 BC. So you're seeing different people take over, and so you make allies with these people, but then all of a sudden there's a new kingdom and you don't know where the hell it came from. For example, if we look at the horse and cart, which eventually become a real problem for how wars would be fought in Egypt, you can see here that in this very same time, the people in Mesopotamia and those places are starting to have them. Whereas in Egypt, this had never been heard before. But it would be only a matter of time, because about 200, 300 years later, Egypt would have them and they would be introduced to the region. The Hyksos, as you will see in a later video, would introduce the horse to the Egyptians, but it wouldn't be a smooth transition. And in the same period in Africa, we can see that East Africans were starting to move now that they were pastoralists, and they moved into places like Kenya and maybe even Tanzania. We also see that they move into the Nubian areas, probably causing conflict or maybe just increasing the society. And this would be a big problem because, again, you see more and more Nubians. Like I said, they almost look like they have an endless supply of Nubians. When we look at the next few people who descend from these guys in the 12th dynasty, you will see that Nubia and Asia just never stop being a problem.